Hi everyone, my name's Dave Greenshields, for those who don't know me. A sincere thank you for being here on the graveyard shift. I will try my best to keep you awake. If you see me nodding off, give me a quick nudge. I think I've got a safety announcement, so essential information about the Queen's Suite. If the fire alarm sounds, we need to leave the building. The exits are through the doors to the auditorium, turn either left or right. Fire escape signs down the staircase to street level. Assembly point is on the green opposite Hall Q. Don't re-enter the building unless authorised. And if you discover a fire, you should shout fire and operate the nearest alarm. Okay? Grass for golf greens. I'm going to try and cover 3 topics during the course of the talk. The first is looking at what grasses should be used when constructing a golf green here in the UK. The second is looking at grass seed and its application in terms of overseeding existing golf greens. And those 2 things are very different, particularly in the UK with the proliferation of soil push-up greens that we have here. And the third one, which I'll probably have time to touch on briefly, are key criteria for successful overseeding. There is a new piece of literature to go alongside that kind of covers the 2 final points there. They are just on this chair by the door if you want to pick one up on the way out. So the first 2 points, so construction of golf greens and overseeding golf greens, really the main body of the talk is looking at 2 trials that have been conducted in conjunction with STRI. The first one of those was started about a decade ago. It was a 4-year trial, and we called it the Golf Green Differential Trial. And it tried to answer 2 key questions. The first one was, if we're sowing a new golf green here in the UK, what's the best seed mix to use? And secondly, how does maintenance of that green affect performance over a period of time? And you can see this trial was run for 4 years. Second trial has finished as recently as July last year. It was looking at overseeding. Again, 2 questions. What's the best method to overseed with? And secondly, what influence does cultivar quality have on overseeding success? So not just looking at species here, but looking at the difference between a high-quality cultivar versus a low-quality cultivar. It's important to point out, so these trials, essentially, the protocol was formulated on our ideas based in discussions with STRI. All of the data you're going to see here today is independent data from the STRI alone, so this is not me wandering around a golf green saying that Barenbrug cultivar is doing very well, okay? This is STRI saying Barenbrug cultivar is doing well, okay? So the Golf Green Differential Input Trial. Called Differential Input Trial because every seed treatment within the trial was subject to 2 forms of maintenance: the standard maintenance and low input maintenance. I'm not going to discuss too much about the low input maintenance today because I think some of these parameters are unrealistic for many member clubs. But the differences between the 2 maintenance regimes were predominantly height of cut, amount of nitrogen. Bear in mind with this number, this was a very sand dominant profile. Mechanical applications in terms of verticutting or brushing. And an important thing to consider throughout this talk is that all of these trials were done with a wear machine. So throughout that 4-year period, a simulated golf wear was going over it. In other words, we tried to set up the trial as close as would be found on a standard golf course, whatever that may be. But there was play on it, in other words. So looking at the seed treatments that we used, we looked at 100% brown top bent, We looked at 100% red fescue, which was split between slender creeping and chewings. A traditional 80-20 blend, so that's 80% fescue with 20%, in this instance, brown top bend. This, the same mix, 80-20, in terms of species, but the difference was in terms of cultivar quality. So here we have Highland bent instead of brown top. We looked at a couple of Cretan bents, we looked at velvet bent, we looked at annual meadowgrass, and there were others that fairly funky things that we don't need to discuss today, bits of ryegrass and things like that. So in terms of assessments, throughout the trial, 5 times we had STRI analyse the plots for botanical composition. Visual merits were done monthly. We looked at the firmness of the greens and we looked at disease as well, but they were the main things we looked at. Just to give you an idea, just a bit of an insight into the trial process, this is how the STRI do a botanical composition. So if you imagine we've got, the plots were, I think they were 2 by 2 meters, so 4 meter squared plots. No, sorry, they were 1 by 1. We have a funny little grid, and when you look down the grid, you see these pins. There's actually pairs of pins. Okay, so you're looking down from here, 1 pin and 1 pin. Essentially, what the guy looking down the grid sees right here, when those 2 pins are aligned, so his head is perfectly over those 2 pins, is what he counts. Whether that's a bentgrass plant, a fescue plant, a poa annua plant, it might be bare ground, he counts it. And he does that 100 times for each plot. I'm glad I wasn't doing it. It might look a touch like me, same colour hair, but that isn't me. But ultimately, that information it's a very laborious method. It's a very accurate method. It's also quite an expensive method. So just to give you an insight into what the trial process is like. So there's a number of graphs, and I do apologise for the proliferation of graphs, but there's no better way, I don't think, of showing the data. This is just an interesting one. So this is considering the trial as a whole. So fescue, bent, all of the seed treatments as a whole, just looking at how much annual meadowgrass invaded the plots during the 4-year trial process. And it's a cautionary word about management. So if you remember, standard management, height of cut, 4 mil, verticut, nitrogen, etc. Well, not surprisingly, we saw more annual meadowgrass come into the trial, considerably more, in comparison with the low input. So it's something that we know, it's something that everyone has seen, everyone's been taught about, but this is some quite up-to-date data to flash in front of your Greens Committee or whatever when they're moaning about height of cut, if you so wish. So let's look at some of the seed treatments themselves. This is the low input, this is the standard input. So for the time being, let's ignore this side of the graph. So we're looking at these 2 here. This is the difference between an 80-20 with brown top, so 80% fescue, 20% brown top bent, and 80% fescue with 20% Highland bent. And this is the botanical composition at the end of the 4-year trial. And you can see the big difference is annual meadowgrass, 80-20 with brown top, had 8% annual meadowgrass at the end. No overseeding was done during this time, so the plots have been left and they've been worn. I think that's a pretty good number for anyone that's grown in a golf green after 4 years. Just one slight change in the seed mix using Highland bent, a cheaper, not as good quality variety, and we have 30% POA at the end of it. Something that we kind of hoped would happen before the trial. I didn't think it would be quite that apparent at the end of 4 years. And at the conclusion of this trial, we basically removed Highland bent from our portfolio of grasses for golf greens. as a result of that. And I think quite a few of our competitors have since done the same. We saw a similar but less dramatic effect on the low input. Interestingly, fescue survived a bit better, as it might be expected. Remember that every month someone's going around giving a visual merit score as well. So just to give you an idea of what this looks like and this looks like in terms of visual merit, it's scored between 1 and 9. So this column here had a score at the end of the trial, an average score of 7.1. This column here had a score of 3.6. And clearly that's the impact of that annual meadowgrass being in the sward and it making it look pretty anemic, pretty weak at times. Looking at poor annual ingression into the 100% bent grass plots. So this one here is a brown top bent. This one and this one are creeping bents. So 10% roughly POA. What is that? It's more than double. 20% roughly. So I guess a cautionary word for people thinking about creeping bent in the UK. And if we looked a bit closer into when this, remember this is at the end of 4 years, if we looked a bit closer into when this annual meadowgrass came in, it was predominantly coming out of winter, going into spring. Brown top bent will start its growth pattern much earlier in the year, so it's much more able to keep annual meadowgrass out at that time when the POA is seeding and things are pretty stressed. Barduo, for interest, is actually a blend of creeping and brown top that seemed to do quite well for whatever reason in the trial. Presumably the brown top was the dominant factor. This was at 4 mil. This was the standard maintenance. A look at surface firmness. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Clegg hammer. I always apologise for this graph because it looks a mess when I click the button. It looks far more complicated than it is. So we had Clegg hammer readings, 6 of them, which are the different colours. And essentially this is what is called a standardised graph. So the 0 line is an average for everything. In other words, if you're above the 0 line, you're firmer than average. If you're below the 0 line, you're softer than average. Fescue, the fescue dominant ones, these two are also fescue dominant. Not surprisingly, the firmest greens. Around about the middle was that combination of creeping bent with brown top bent. Any ideas what this might be? I'm sure I heard it. Velvet bent. Interesting grass species. Tempting grass species when you see it in a quite a new plot. It produces thatch very, very quickly. It's aggressive, so it's quite easy to get into an annual meadowgrass sward, but when I see these kind of numbers, I would question whether the benefit is long-term. If you're wanting, I would assume that one of the reasons for overseeding was to go from a softish annual meadowgrass sward to a firmer fine grass sward. If that's the case, I'm not convinced velvet bent is the right option for you. Quick look at fescue. So this is the 100% fescue mix. Standard inputs, relaxed inputs. A couple of points to raise here. We didn't feed it enough initially. So I've seen this a couple of places that have tried to sow out fescue from the start. You still need to, it's a low maintenance grass, but it needs feed to establish. So this number, we should have got this far higher initial point. After that, the decline is more dramatic in the standard input. So yes, this is a sand-based root zone in Bingley, and it's done over 4 years, one location. But I think that the other take-home message is here: fescue does get walked off with winter wear, and I think that if you're trying to maintain a fescue-dominant sward, you do need to keep overseeding to maintain the level of fescue. If you don't overseed, you can go from very fescue dominant to not very fescue dominant pretty quickly. Okay. So, end of the trial, just to give you an idea of visual merit scores of all the mixtures, or the main mixtures. The 80-20 with brown top came out best. Brown top bent. Velvet for visual merit was pretty good because it does look quite nice. Cretan bents, fescue, because a lot of POA came in. 80-20 Highland, so again that highlights the difference that a small change can make. And the annual meadowgrass, well, the STRI didn't like the look of it. I'll leave it at that. So conclusions from that 4-year trial. It certainly showed in that trial location that a mixture of red fescue and brown top bent was the best option. It was a clear result from the trial. 100% creeping bent. I think if you're going to have winter play, it's going to be difficult to maintain that sward. And I think the same can be said for 100% red fescue. There are 1 or 2 examples of 100% fescue golf courses in the UK, but they are not played on too much in the winter, if at all. So I think, again, winter wear and fescue is something that needs to be considered. Velvet bent has a thatch issue, and, well, certainly in my opinion, the surface softness outweighs any beneficial aspect of that species. Pomerania and Highland bent offer little benefits for golf greens on a year-round basis. And this was, well, this slide was written a few years ago. Overseeding is a different scenario. So we started a new trial in 2012. A reminder, we're looking at the effects of overseeding method and also the role that grass seed selection has to play on overseeding success. So what we tried to do was to create a POA Highland bent mix, I guess not dissimilar from a sward that many of you may manage. It was on a sand dominant root zone, which I appreciate is not the same as a soil push-up golf green, but we can talk a little bit about that in terms of criteria for overseeding later. We overseeded the green twice, in spring and autumn of 2014. And we used 6 different seed mixtures and 2 different methods. Bear in mind you're operating on very small plots here, so running a tracked amount of disc seeder through them is not an option. You can't switch that on and off in that tighter space. So we had to opt for pedestrian seeders. So we used the grade and sand injector with both a fescue and a bentgrass reel on the back of it. And we also used what I would describe as a surface preparation and drop method. In other words, a dimple seeder. So something that pricks the surface, hopper on the back, seed goes in, and it's brushed or rolled in behind. So 2 very different methods there. And again, the trial was managed in accordance with good practice. So height of cut was 4 mil summer, 6 mil winter, and the wear machine was applied at all times. And again, we used the botanical composition to clearly measure how much success we'd had, so before and after those overseeding applications. And we did some visual merit assessments also. So, doing for time. Whew. 2 overseedings. These were the mixtures, these were the rates. So, brown top bent, Highland bent, the 80-20 with brown top, the 80-20 with Highland, a very high quality fescue, red fescue mix, and a red fescue mix towards the middle or the bottom of the BSPB STRI turfgrass seed table. As I said, 2 methods. So here we are at the start of the overseeding, so just before the first overseed, and we have created a POA bent sward. I would have liked to have seen more POA. That would have really, in hindsight, I would have probably let that go another year, or certainly another 6 months before we did anything. But that's where we were at the start of the trial. You can see all the plots were fairly consistent in their makeup. So after 2 overseedings in spring and in autumn, the next botanical composition was done in November of that same year. And this is what was achieved. So fescue into the sward at around somewhere between 15 and 20% in all 4 treatments that had fescue in them. We've seen the POA increase in all plots during that period of time. That was probably expected considering where we were. Okay? So what we can see, there has been an impact in the plots that we've put bent grass in. See, the bent is higher in these 2 than it is in the other 4, where there was less bent put back in, or none. So looking a bit more closely, this is the percentage of bent grass decline in the plots. So all the plots declined in bent grass because POA was coming in. The question is by how much, and we see, even in the course of 1 year, the effect of having a high quality brown top bent versus the Highland bent. These 2 had a little bit of bent in them. The control here is just the straight fescue overseeds combined. So we then let the plots go for another through the winter, so more wear. And I guess the ultimate question is always, I see germination when I overseed, but how does it last until the following year? And we can see here that we do have a decent amount of fescue remaining. You know, oh yeah, okay, it's between 10 and 15%, but for 2 overseeds in 1 year, I think that's a reasonable success rate. In this short space of time, we are already seeing the effect of choosing quality seed over average seed. So here we have more fescue. Here we have more fescue in comparison with this. Okay, so I might be saving 10 or 15 pounds a bag on my grass seed, but if I'm going to the bother of asking my guys to go out and do that, have all the disruption for members, am I really going to save 10 or 15 pounds for the sake of losing a chunk of fescue over the winter because it's the fescue that's not tolerant of close mowing, not tolerant of wear as much? Similarly with the bent grass, here versus here. So, results and conclusions for that second trial. With good seeding rates, then they weren't huge. They were standard seeding rates. 2 overseeding applications. In 1 year, the botanical composition has been positively affected in terms of fescue and bent. Red fescue populations increased to around 15% on average during year 1, and about 10% remained until the summer of the following year. Interestingly, the visual merit scores, which I haven't included here, but there are in the booklet. Even these very small gains in 1 year of your overseeding program led to independent people from the STRI saying those plots looked better during winter and early spring. Bent grass population in control plots, i.e. the ones that didn't have any bent put in them, declined by 20% during 2014. In the case of brown top, 2 overseeds reduced that decline to only 5%. So keep overseeding if bent is your dominant grass, or fescue for that matter. In terms of the method, interestingly, basically no difference. Dimple seeder, Graydon, no difference. Actually, the dimple seeder was fractionally better, but not significantly so. So I would say that surprised me. I would say that if you're considering an overseeding program, you should consider some of the other factors in here before thinking too much about what piece of kit you need to put the grass into the green with. High quality seed produced better results at the end of the trial in 6 out of 6 like-for-like treatments. Please don't scrimp to save 10 or 15 pounds a bag on seed. So, briefly running through what's in this booklet. I'm often asked, should I overseed? And the worst thing as somebody that works for a company that produces and sells seed is seeing seed bought and not producing the results that people expect from it. And quite often the answer is, no, you shouldn't overseed yet. We need to really consider a number of criteria before we start the overseeding program and during that overseeding program. Course conditions, I think the predominant factors here are drainage, both underneath the profile and at the surface of the green. Thatch is a massive issue in overseeding success. If you see lines of seed 2 weeks after you've put it in the ground and feel that nothing is still there 6 months in advance, the likely cause of that is thatch. It's been able to germinate, but it hasn't been able to get its roots through that thatch layer and establish successfully. Light and air are other key factors. If you've got a golf green surrounded by trees, you're going to struggle to get fine grasses to grow there. So some subtle movement of trees when the member's not looking is advisable. Timings and weather are very important. Had a conversation this morning with a guy on the stand who's a big believer in fescue overseeding, and he said he overseeds 6 times a year with the knowledge that 2 of them are not going to do anything. That's his opinion. You've got to get lucky with timing. This winter shows that we can't really predict what the weather's going to throw at us. So you've got to be prepared to keep going at it. Sooner or later, you're going to hit the right temperature, the right amount of water, and you're going to get a really good strike. Creating space in the sward, I would say a really big factor. If you've got a really, really tight sward, realistically putting young seedlings in there, trying to get them to be competitive in that sward is very difficult. So I've put mechanically or chemically. I think if you're inland and you're operating predominantly on POA, I think you need to open that sward up mechanically. I think that if you're a links-based guy and trying to get fescue in, we've seen really good results with the rescue herbicide to create some space in the sward. Overseeding method and frequency, so machinery is in there, but species, depths, renovation. You've really got to decide if you're renovating your green or trying to exchange the species in the green. That's important. If you're renovating, you know, that might be once a year. That might be just trying to maintain what you've got. But if you're really going to try and push a species exchange program, change what is in the green, you have to be overseeding 3, 4, 5 times a year for 2 or 3 years before you can assess whether that's going to really completely change. If you do that, and these conditions are right, you will get success. Subsequent maintenance also needs to be considered. So clearly, mowing at 3 mil and verticutting when you've got seedlings in the ground is not a good idea. I know we've all got to produce a surface for the members, but what happens in the 2 or 3 months after that seed is in the ground is important. Some herbicides will kill young seedlings. Iron sulfate will desiccate young seedlings. Fertilizer is always an interesting one. I always say that you shouldn't. The green should go in very lean into the overseed, and when you see seedlings appear, that's the time to give it some fertilizer. Otherwise, you're just giving too much to surrounding competition. As I say, all of these points are covered in detail here, so please feel free to pick one of these up on the way out. Thanks very much for listening, and any time for 2 or 3 minutes for questions, if possible. Yeah.
Is the seed coated?
We currently do not coat grass seed for the UK market. We coat in the States, where you can add some quite interesting things like fungicide, but you're not allowed to do that in Europe. We've trialled a vast number of seed coats. We have seen no benefits in any of our trials at this point. Mycorrhiza is an interesting thing to try and integrate into a seed coat. Getting the mycorrhiza established in a new plant is extremely difficult. You need to add far more mycorrhiza inoculant than you can successfully get onto a seed. In other plants, in horticulture, it's been very successful, usually with much bigger seeds than grass. Physically getting the number on there is very difficult. There are some coatings out there. I don't think they work very well. Okay, thanks guys.